Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Two Friends Film Podcast. My name is Brian, and as always, I'm here with Fowler. Say hello.
I am here and I'm queer. Let's get started.
it's been it's been a bit since we've gone. Actually, fun fact: this is on this date. This is our 1 year anniversary. So there we go. And to celebrate, this time we watched Brokeback Mountain. So
We decided to celebrate our love as two men for each other by watching a film about a very different love between two other
yeah,
men.
a little bit of a different vibe there. So, as always, we're gonna start with a summary here. So here it goes. Brokeback
When we go
Mountain.
fishing, we actually go fishing.
Yeah,
That's all I'm going to say
exactly.
about that.
Yeah, we. So here's the summary. So Brokeback Mountain is a story that takes place in the American West from 1963 to 1983. It's a story about two ranch hands named Ennis Del Mar and Jack Twist, who work on Brokeback Mountain as sheep herders in 1963. They slowly develop a homosexual relationship with one another, and then both men agreed to part ways after they're done working for that season. Both men live separate lives, finding different wives to settle down with, but still yearn for each other. The men then decide to have correspondence again with one another and decide to take an annual fishing trip to Brokeback Mountain as a pretext to have an affair without their wives' knowledge. Elma Del Mar finds out about the affair and divorces Ennis shortly thereafter. At the same time, Jack's marriage is also deteriorating because of reckless behavior, such as his extramarital affairs and his alcoholism. As Ennis's life becomes more complicated, his correspondence with Jack becomes fewer and fewer until his last meeting with Jack on a trip where Jack confesses that they could have had a good life together. Shortly after this trip, Ennis is informed by uh, Lorraine that Jack was beaten to death. This leads Ennis into a depression and meeting Jack's parents to say his final condolences. Sometime later, Ennis's daughter meets him at at his trailer to inform him that she's getting married and she would like him to be there. Although Ennis is hesitant at first, he agrees to go to the wedding and reminisces on his time with Jack. So that's the brief summary there. So right away, we'll get into the strengths and weaknesses a little bit here and talk about that. So
Do you
for
want to just really quickly talk about, because Brokeback Mountain isn't just a normal movie, I think it's kind of a staple film that represents a lot in
yeah,
history. Do you want
I
to go into that? I think that's
yeah,
interesting.
I could talk about that history a little bit. So Brokeback Mountain is kind of a landmark in terms of queer cinema. At the time, it was a heavy risk. Ang Lee directed it, and it was, I believe, in 2005, which is like well before the codification of or the legal status of gay marriage being legalized in the states in 2014. So it was a huge, huge risk by the studio and by everyone involved. Um, it's one of those films that kind of portrays sexuality in a rather fluid way. I think it's interesting to talk about because there's even to today still debates about um, Jack Twist and Ernest Elmar's sexuality, but also like what it is for queer cinema as a whole. Obviously, a lot of queer related media deals with tragedy, including this one, of course. But it's it's kind of a landmark in terms of how prevalent this film was at the time, and it was a huge talking point politically and in many facets at the time because of the quote unquote controversy around it. So
Hmm.
it's interesting to, especially as a retrospective, to watch it now, just because it's about 20 years since it's been released. So, and the way we view it today is rather less controversial than given the time. Um, but
Although there's interesting critiques of it in a modern sense by sort of queer scholars.
Yeah, a lot of times, like I said, with that tragedy element of it, at least from people I've seen in the queer community talk about it, it's not always viewed in a favorable measure, which I think is rather interesting because even though it is a landmark piece of cinema for queer sort of endeavors there, it the problem lies in that it doesn't
But
it,
we'll get
it
into that. We'll get into
yeah,
that.
we'll get into that. But that's kind of a roundabout way of like giving you an overview of what this film meant to the state of media at that point. Um, so first off, I'm going to go into a couple strengths, and Fowler will join me in that endeavor. So first off, I want to say something I really like, in particular, is the accent work. I am a nerd for like, uh, sort of accent work and those types of things. Um, what gets me is that both these men, like Heath Ledger's an Australian, Jake Gyllenhaal American, but they get this sort of thing going, and I think what's interesting is particularly with Heath Ledger. Um, so Heath Ledger and Estelle, and we'll talk about this in the character overview a little bit. I don't want to step on your toes here, Fowler, but I will say, Anis Delmar is kind of a repressed person. So whenever he speaks, it's very almost like guttural, almost he speaks like without moving his lips that much, without a lot of emotional weight behind. Like the emotional weight is kind of similarly tucked behind himself. So I think that's one thing that I really enjoyed about the film is that embodying the character in that way is a fascinating choice by Heath Ledger in this role.
And
Uh,
Jack Twist is the opposite. Like he's the more free spirited, open gay cowboy, and he's portrayed, and the way he talks with Gyllenhaal is like much more freewheeling and eloquent and almost like old fashioned, like jibber jabber kind of. Like the way that they talk, quite literally, is like representative of the characters.
Yeah, and it's an interesting choice by both actors in that respect. I think something that is beautiful about this film is the sweeping setting and the music. Most of this film was filmed on location in Wyoming and different sort of adjacent Midwestern states, and I just love the cinematography, the camera work there to capture that essence of like that sweeping sort of environment because
Although I will say it's more of a thing for the first half of the film, which is
yeah.
in their summer in Brokeback Mountain. The a lot of the really beautiful landscape shots that like the film is known for.
Mm,
The later half of the film, when they settle down and have families, it's the camera work and the visuals are, I think, a little more conventional. It's really
yeah.
the first half of the movie that's so visually stunning.
I think what it is though is that it's indicative of like this in my eyes uh essentially this uh telling a story with the camera, right? Especially in the first half. Because the first half, there's this freedom to express themselves on Brokeback, and that's what they do, right? And that's what these open landscapes give them. It gives them a freedom, it gives them less constraints. But when they settle down with their families and everything like that, it all changes in that form, right?
It's an interesting point.
Yeah, so it's that contrasting sort of two living two lives kind of thing. Yeah, like I said, a lot of the original music is beautiful and breathtaking. Um, Something I want to point out too is, again, on the accent work and the emotional weight, is the acting. Um, Brilliantly acted, right? Like,
Even
there's.
by the side characters, the wives, Alma and Lorraine, are also like really well acted. Alma in particular, I think, is like kind of a standout in terms of the supporting cast. She's like very um, powerful as this woman who initially loves Ennis and then slowly becomes bitter about him, and then she's sort of this interesting combination of hardening over time but being very vulnerable emotionally.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing because you get to see this evolution of a character, right? Um, Especially with Alma, it's like a she's kind of put in this box and kind of expected to do these lively roles, but then when she is like calling out Ennis on whatever the fuck he's doing, she's able to express herself in a way that she really up to that point has never really been able to express herself at all, right?
Although
Um,
you see the hints of it, I think
yeah,
earlier. Like I think
you see
her
cracks of it
progression is really good.
for sure. You see different sort of elements of it for sure. But I think that for and another thing, actually, to go off that, what do you think about other strengths as well? Is there something that you were seeing before we go into sort of the weaknesses of it?
I don't think we've talked about like I really like the music of this film.
Yeah,
Like I think like and it's quite varied. Like if you listen to like the beginning parts where they're up on the mountain herding sheep and it's very minimal and they like pair it with like the sound of the sheep going down the mountain and like the lightning storm and then like at the end when it's much more classical when like Ennis goes to Jack Twist's house or his parents' house and like he sort of settles down or when his like his daughter comes to visit him as sort of a strange daughter like I think this movie has it's really good musically, and it has a pretty solid range of music. I think.
yeah, I think it's one of those ones that because obviously some films rely on like their own original score, and some films rely on previously recorded tracks. This is obviously in the former camp rather than the latter. Um, I think it adds this striking element to like we talked about with the setting and everything like that. It adds that dynamic flow that I think what translates a good to a great film. You know. Uh,
Mm.
um. So off the weaknesses, I had a little trouble coming up with many. There weren't a lot of things I thought about nitpicking. Um, what is something that you, Fowler, thought that uh could be worked on in a film like this?
Well, this is going to be a more contentious review because Brokeback Mountain is one of Brian's favorite films, and I actually didn't like the film very much. I think I think it's a super flawed film. I think it is. It has to be viewed. I think more um, in a more complicated fashion because of its place in queer cinema. But I don't necessarily think this is a great film. I don't think it's a particularly good romance. I don't think it's a particularly good character study. I
Yeah,
before we watched after we watched the film, I told Brian like directly after viewing like this was kind of a flawed film. Like there are good parts of it, but it's a very flawed film. And
I
then we
think
looked up on IMDb the ratings, and they were okay but not great. And you were raging out. You were not pleased.
I was not raging out. Okay,
You were
that's
raging
a
out a
little
little bit.
hyperbolic. I was curious as to why it was. I mean, for you, like let's get into it a little bit because I think this would be good because this is the first film in a while that we've had kind of differing opinions. You say it's a bad romance film. What makes it a bad romance film for you?
Well, we have to start with the limitations of the story because the story is very difficult. Because Jack Twist and Elmer or Ennis Mar, they're it's not just that they're repressed; it's that they're not very educated and they're not very emotionally intelligent. They're not very eloquent. And you know, there are other films that are able to work with that, where it's a very minimal script. But I don't think this film does a very good job. Like they really don't discuss their feelings or their relationship very cogently together. Their Ernest in particular is not particularly self-aware of who he is as a person, um, and they like are incapable of processing their emotions. And I think it hurts the film. It makes the film feel
But
pretty empty.
it
I
here's my
think
sorry.
and to be fair, like they're not necessarily characters who are predisposed to that level of like emotional intelligence. I don't think that's necessarily an excuse. Like I think there are plenty of working class characters who are emotionally intelligent and are able to like be better at articulating what's happening in themselves. I think like Huck Finn is a great example of a character who's like blithely ignorant for most of the story, but like you know, and this film doesn't really do that
I think,
at all.
well, my question to you is like, obviously, yeah, you can be emotionally intelligent, but come from like that sort of rough and tumble sort of like not an education in a formal sense. But my question to you is like, isn't that kind of the point of the film? The film is all about how, you know, emotional repression as well as like a lack of emotional intelligence could lead to the downfall of a relationship that could potentially work out, you know?
There are lots of things that are realistic but are not enjoyable if you watch it for 2.5 hours. I think there's a responsibility of a creative to, um, in some ways, glamorize, but in other ways, just like make more pleasing or artistic or more moving than the reality.
I
Which,
mean,
yes, is a bunch of queer buff barbers eating beans together in the cold mountains in between hooking up and never speaking about it. But for me as a viewer, like I find that quite empty, and
well,
I think it's really a film that is muddled. Not just not it's not just that the characters are muddled, the film feels muddled, and I don't think that's a positive element of this film.
I think well, I don't know if you're characterizing it well, because, like, truly, what the film is all about is it's truly about two men who can't commit to certain like the love that they feel because of societal pressure. Like, I don't think like the average experience for a person in that time, especially 63 to 83, would be one of acceptance of oneself. Uh,
You don't have to be accepting. You can be emotionally tortured. You can be Shakespearean. A lot of great early feminist literature, like Jane Austen, is that. But like, I need more from you than inarticulate grunting.
but are
And this
they
film
are
is not like the characters are just not expressive. You don't feel really that emotionally attached to them because they're so empty and
I,
they're so unexpressive and they're so blank.
I just
And
feel like truly with these characters in particular, I I don't know if that's like I know I'm pushing back a lot here and we have to get to the characters at some point. But I truly feel like uh, as a character study, I think it's important to understand that like some pieces of cinema uh have characters that aren't able to do the things we do, right? um or think in the ways that we think or act in the ways we want to act, right? Like
I'm not saying that they should be happy and open and accepting and gay. I'm not critiquing the inner turmoil of the characters or their
well,
personal
you're
confusion.
critiquing
I'm
the
saying,
are how they're articulating their emotional sort of
yeah, you
turmoil.
could articulate their emotional confusion in a more eloquent, like better way. Like I'm just saying there's a lack of um
Don't you think that
like
like turning away from communication is a form of in itself showcasing uh, or repression?
it can in better films. I just don't think this is a film that does it very well. I like you can have the character that is deeply emotionally conflicted or even completely inarticulate and do it well. But for this film is so much of these like empty spaces of silence and characters sort of um, just sort of sitting uneasily next to each other. And for me, like it's a very long movie. It is not always a tonally like strong movie. And for me, like I think it's a major weakness of this film. Um,
It's interesting because I feel like those elements of it are actually elements that I would categorize as being rather good. Like I would say that like if as a
I don't think this
filmmaker.
is a you have an emotional investment to this film though, and like I think the reviews are correct. And even when you watched it with your friends and they said the movie is long and at times like drags, I think this is what they're talking about is like the constant lack of communication across the 2 hours. And this goes to another weakness, which is a lack of emotional growth. And some of this is I think this is actually made more strong by characters like Alma, who change dramatically. Jack Twist and Ennis Del Mar do not change as characters really until the very end when Jack dies. Like they're really the same characters over time, and it's not even in a way like it's a hubris, like they're destroyed by central faults, although they are. Like you can make a film like that good, but it's a film that's very static, and I think it's often static in an uninteresting way, where the turmoil for me internally is just not expressed enough, and it's just not powerfully made enough. Like it just really feels like 50 years pass or like 30 years pass of these two eating beans and not talking to each other, the audience. And for me, like, I don't necessarily find that great cinema. And
Well,
I think you
do
can. I think
you?
there's lots of good movies about self-hatred and
But
repression that make that case more powerfully.
here's the
And in
thing,
fact,
though.
like,
Like, I don't. I truly think that, um, like, in order to make a film about repression and about, self hatred, because this is what this film is about, right? Repression and self hatred. I I think that, like, you're not going to have a thing where there's this open dialogue and this honest communication, because I think most people who are self-hating and repressed, they're not willing to, like, go out and talk about it, or like.
you don't have to talk about it to your partner or to the audience, but like The Sopranos, The Wire, like a lot of movies and shows that involve toxic masculinity and repression, like I think they more powerfully and more entertainingly are able to capture it. Like I think this is a film that tries to use minimalism to achieve its goal, and it doesn't succeed because like I don't think the chemistry is there necessarily between Ennis and Jack, and I don't think like they themselves stand out or pop very well as characters, and I think they they're so limited and they're so static as like entities in the story that for me like it just felt very glossy. I didn't feel the
I
investment in the characters in the way that
see.
like a better film would have.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if they're static in that way that you're describing, because Jack's, uh like, his he fills this void of emptiness with alcohol and with, uh you know other men, right? And that sort of thing. And, Ennis, uh even though he stays, I would say you're correct in Ennis, where he stays more static. um there's still this element of him that, like, is not accepting who he is, or what he is, or what this relationship means to him. So I think.
But again, you can be like someone who doesn't accept or rejects change, and you can be a character who is inner like his inner conflict and still like evolve as a character. If it
Mhm.
wasn't for the makeup as they age, I feel like you wouldn't know. Like Jack Twist remains a reckless, somewhat desperate and insecure character who's constantly like reaching out for something: alcohol, drugs, prostitutes, affairs, Ennis himself in order to save himself because he's so self-destructive and he's so unable to be alone. And Ennis kind of remains a character that's very emotionally aloof, very like bland, that is unable to communicate and is unable to shift out of like the sort of vision of himself that he never had. And I just think it's not a very dynamic film. And I think you can see other films, even queer films, that do this better. Like um, and another weakness of this film, I think, is I'm not necessarily a person who subscribes to the idea that like gayness has to be pain, and like any film that involves gay romance is a tragedy. And I think especially if you take a historical context like Midwestern 1960s America, of course there's gonna be a lot of tragedy to it. But like I think to tell an entertaining story, there has to be joy in it. And I think a film that actually does this better, a queer film, is Priscilla, which is a film about drag queens who basically travel across the Australian outback to do a show at this casino. And Priscilla is a very dark film. Like there's a part of like, Priscilla deals with a lot of very horrific elements of life. There's literally a scene where one of the main characters, like they attempt to lynch her or him. But like there is like a liveliness to Priscilla. You really feel like you get the characters on the journey, like you empathize with them, and like even through their suffering and their Schadenfreude and all that, like there's an outlet like you enjoy them as characters. Like they feel alive to me, and they just don't feel alive in Brokeback Mountain. There's a lot of parts of Brokeback Mountain that are good, the aesthetics, the music, the visuals, the accents, the acting, but I just don't think the heart of the story, the beating heart, is there in a way that it would need to be a great film. It will always be a landmark film, but I don't think that necessarily means it's a great film.
It's interesting because, like, obviously, this is where we disagree. I think that, like, what makes it a great film for me is the element of tragedy and the element of, because there's a realness and a rawness to that, right? Like, this isn't just like an experience that I think is isolated to sort of a Hollywood retelling of a story. This feels like a story that's happened, and it probably has happened. So
It has definitely happened many times.
yeah, so I think for me, and maybe I'm too close to the sun here because I do love this film. But for me, it's that rawness and that emotional sort of honestness that I think is something that works for me.
But like, is it really emotionally raw? Like, in a way that you feel it maybe, but like, does the average audience feel that rawness? Like the critiques about it being boring, even from your friends, but even from the reviews, like it comes from that lack of emotionality, lack of expressiveness. And you can have a character that is deeply repressed, and you can have a story that is deeply dark and sad in this way, that is emotionally potent in the way this film is not. Like the Scarlet Letter, where the minister who has the affair of Hester Prynne, like he basically goes mad because and his health is destroyed because of his affair and the fact that the puritanical society they live in, the hyper religious puritanical society, means that he views for doing this he's damned. And like you have these moments of him like tearing at his chest and like flagellating himself, and like this frenzy of him as a character even when he goes about his life, because he thinks that he's like going to burn forever and he can't survive the guilt of it. You know what I mean? There's other stories like that. Like I just feel like this film, there are more dramatic examples, and yes, more emotionally powerful examples of the same material being covered better. Like I think this is a film that was really provocative and very powerful and will always have a place in history. I don't necessarily think as a piece of art it holds out like on its own. I just think it's been done better. And I think that's a shame because there's a lot of good actors on this project, and um, I think the story is a really interesting one. Um, but I don't know if it pulls together. It's such a simple story, and it's such a minimal story. And I think for a story like that to work, there are emotional components, dramatic components that this film just doesn't do very well.
I mean, I guess we do need to move on to the characters just because, time constraints and everything. But one last bit I will say is that I think it's one of those things where there are elements of it that ring true to me from my own personal experiences as a queer man myself, um, in terms of like that sort of thought process. So I think that for me, the realness and the rawness probably comes from some of that. But
Mm.
I will say that I think there are things in this story that, yes, do they drag? Yes, I will agree on that end of it. But I think that in my eyes, it's an honest reading of what life could have been like in this time period in history, in this place in history, and for me, that's why I think the story resonates with me a lot there.
I agree, but also my last point, like this is entertainment and this is like a dramatization. I think like a really great story is able to transcend the drudgery of the the world of that history. Do you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
there are a lot of very bleak, ugly, empty existences that films have been about, where if you told them in a real play by play, it would just be a miserable, ugly experience. And there's a place for those stories. But like, I think what great films do is they bridge the divide and they allow people who don't have necessarily a personal attachment to the material to feel that emotionality. And I think they also take those stories and they give them um, maybe not a sparkle, but a radiance. They make you feel the liveliness of it and the characters, and they make you feel emotionally attached to them. And I don't necessarily know if that this film does that. because there are stories like any story about like Victorian, like industrial England where you're poor. It's a miserable experience. Like any Charles Dickens narrative.
Hmm.
Like there is a humanity to those stories that I don't necessarily think exists in this film. This film feels very blank-eyed and empty, and it relies really heavily on the music and the landscaping to really overcome, I think, a lot of the failings of how these characters are written and how they interact. Like I really, there are characters, there are stories about forbidden relationships that you really feel. I never felt like Jack Twist and Ennis Del Mar, or they never felt like this powerful, like burn everything in my life to keep you relationship. Like, yeah, I just didn't feel that tension and that magic. You know what I mean? And like it just felt empty and sad in a way that I don't think was um, always useful or intended.
Yeah, I don't know. We do have to move on just because of time, but we will probably talk about this further in the questions and everything.
Mhm.
So with
The
character,
characters I think is pretty short, like because
okay.
Ennis and Jack are basically, I think that they respond to homosexuality being criminalized, sometimes the pain of death, in basically the opposite way. Ennis is a character driven largely by fear. He witnessed his father may have murdered a gay man named Earl and tortured him to death, and he's shown the body when he's young, and that like consumes Ennis for the rest of his life. He's like terrified of basically being a homosexual, being affiliated with homosexuality. He refuses to really live with Jack Twist or spend time with Jack Twist. Um, and he his shame destroys his life. He's incapable of taking risks, and he basically, after Jack Twist dies, he's in this state where he realizes that he lost everything because he just never tried. He's incapable of being this hyper masculine traditionalist, this family man. He ruins his family. He himself gets his ass kicked all the time, and as a, like he is not a typical conforming like Midwestern traditional man, but he also can't take the leap. He's a man without a country, and that's his destruction. And Jack Twist is the opposite. Jack Twist is someone who, in a much more fundamental way, like unable to be alone, and he's unable to cope and bear it, and it causes Jack Twist increasingly desperately to seek something to fill the void and make him feel like he isn't alone, and he tries to find that void through Ennis, and he's very needy and insecure about Ennis, but ultimately when Ennis is not what he does, like he replaces Ennis with alcoholism and other relationships, and he's so reckless about the way he lives his life that he's murdered. And I think it's debatable whether the film frames this in a romantic or positive way or not. But like, I think their ends are really the opposite ways that you can respond to society repressing you. That's really all I had to say.
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I think it is truly a reaction to two different questions, right, of how society sort of views it. I will say something to add to it is that I think truly as a character study, um, it's important to look at these two guys uh, as like elements of like what masculinity means to both of them, because I think they view masculinity in two different ways. And I like
What do you mean?
so here's the thing. I think Ennis, his view on masculinity is rather traditional, right? I think Ennis tends to view masculinity as like a you provide for your family, you do what you need to survive, and you know everything else is kind of you know whatever in terms of that. I think Jack, however, views masculinity in the same way what we talked about with freedom. He views uh, his own form of masculinity as the freedom to do what he wants when he wants, and you know sort of seek pleasure and avoid pain as much as possible. And I
Hmm.
I think that's kind of like indicative of like how these characters interact in their world as well.
It's interesting you say that Jack Twist, um, that he, because I agree, he's a very fun-loving, free-spirited figure, almost to a fault. It's interesting that you say that's part of his social conditioning, because I don't know if I would agree with that. Like, even before Jack Twist, like, he moves out of Wyoming. He's the only character that does it really in the entire film. He's the only one that really travels.
Yeah.
Like, but like he travels to Texas to be a bull rider, and he himself admits that like the days of bull riding are over. That like there's no money in it. That it's a brutal business where you can get your neck snapped by the horse and or the cow the bull and die instantly.
Mm.
But, like he does it anyway, and I don't know if like that's painted in a way where people are valorizing him. You know what I mean? Like I feel like in a lot of ways, Jack's um, free spirited nature, like I think that is him resisting societal repression. Like the way that he is socially conditioned, the way that his father raised him and his father is would be to stay in Wyoming and be a rancher. It's not to move to fucking Texas and ride bulls for a living, let alone the homosexuality and the trips to Mexico and the affairs. Like I would say that that is in itself a rebellion
Yeah,
of his
I
character.
think, but like I'm talking more so about like how he views himself, right? Like how he views uh taking back elements of himself, right? Like um in order to prove himself as a man, uh you know, he wants to do things on his own terms. And I think that's what's important to look at with that character as well.
Hmm. It's an interesting analysis. I don't know if I agree, but it's interesting. I never thought about it that
Yeah.
way.
Speaking of that, actually, is it cool if we go into the questions now?
Let's fucking do it.
All right, let's fucking do it. So speaking on that masculinity thing, I'm actually curious. What do you think this story tells us about toxic masculinity within that subculture of like that Midwestern culture there?
Well, for one, I think two things. One is masculinity is socially conditioned. Like Ennis's behaviors are not traditional Midwestern behaviors. Like he does them because he's afraid of being beaten to death with a crowbar until his face explodes, like Jack Twist ends up or Earl in his childhood. Like that culture is viciously and violently maintained, and what they view as natural isn't. And I think that's shown through like the homosexual sort of like outings they have as like young men in Brokeback, like where you have all the landscapes. Like that's them naturally. Later with the families and like their interactions in the world, like very claustrophobic, like societally constrained. I think that's a point the film makes. The other point I think the film makes is that those socially conditioned masculine roles are cyclical. Like, we don't really see Jack Twist get beaten to death in the film. We don't see Earl murdered and tortured in the film. The person who's super fucking violent in this film is Ennis Del Mar. He's violent towards Jack Twist. He's violent towards his wife Alma. Like, and he's violent often when they accidentally or intentionally challenge his masculinity. And like, you know, Ennis is both the largest victim of homophobia and masculinity in this film, toxic masculinity. He is also the perpetrator of it to his family, to his children, to his partner. And I think you can see this to a more limited extent with Jack Twist as well. Like his alcoholism, his like constant trips, the extravagance, like a lot of that is also like his response to needing to be a certain type of masculine. And it damages his relationship with his wife. It damages his relationship with the family. It damages his business. Like, um, masculinity is something that is very viciously socially enforced, and those who of whom it is enforce it on other people. That's kind of my takeaway.
Yeah, I think this film kind of paints the picture of like Especially, I think the film more so talks about it with Ennis rather than Jack, because I think Ennis is probably the biggest example of a toxic masculinity there, right? Um, what I think it showcases is that uh, our norms and our sort of uh, the way we conduct ourselves is indicative of the environment we grow up in, right? Jack was shown things, or I'm sorry, Ennis was shown like a tortured man much early in his life, which affected him traumatically, right? And it kind of changed his perspective on what it means to be a man, what it means to be homosexual in society. And I think for me, um, it's it's kind of it tells you and it informs you of like why uh, Ennis turns out to be the man he is now, right? So I guess with that was the major question I had. Did you you said you had some other things as well, right?
Yeah. What do you think the film says about repression?
I think for me, it says that when we look at repression, right? Obviously, not great to not live your true self, right? Because that's what the film is obviously saying to you out loud. Um, but I think for me, the film tells us that people will repress themselves if they need to conform in certain in certain extreme environments, right? I think this environment being this anti queer is an environment where people will hide and do what they need to survive, but it will cost parts of them, right? And it
Hmm.
will affect how they interact in the world, who they become. You know, Ennis's repression was obviously his downfall, but it's the only thing he knew because if he tried to live authentically or tried to live true to himself, there might be a chance that he would have ended up like Jack, dead. And
Not just a chance. I mean, definitely would have happened to him
yeah, it would have happened
since
at
he
some
never
point.
moved away.
Yeah. But I think for me, it's one of those things where it showcases uh, the extremes that some people will have to take in order to survive. And in that survival, it's hard to say what's worse, surviving in a way that's like non-conducive to being true to oneself, or death in the freedom of being oneself.
Well, I think the film is very clear on which side it stands with. Jack Twist is a far more romanticized figure than Ennis is.
Yeah,
You know,
of
like
course.
the ending, I think makes it pretty clear. Um, I think a more interesting point that I felt is not just that repression you sacrifice yourself; it's that repression doesn't work and you hurt everyone around you.
Yeah,
Like Ennis, it's not like Ennis Delmar is a good father or a good husband, or
hmm,
that he treats his wife well or his children well. It's not
yeah,
like Jack is like able to be good to his wife, or he's like either of them are fucking valued or like useful members of their families, their communities. You know what I mean? Like it's not just that the repression hurts them; they hurt everything around them. They're incapable of conforming. They're incapable of being committed, and they like the repression hurts society. I think is like another point. Like the repression of those two gay men is also the repression of like everyone that really gets into contact with them. All the women who was like are just ruined by Ennis Delmar's presence, his
yeah,
family, his daughters, even Jack Twist himself. Like, there's a really telling. It's one of the most powerful parts of the film where Ennis meets with Anne Hathaway, Anne Hathaway's character Lorraine, and you can just see that like the years of being married to Jack Twist have aged her as a person. You know what I mean? And made her a more cynical person. And um, yeah, like the film really makes the argument that like the repression isn't just bad for gay men; it's bad for everyone.
yeah. And I think it's one of those things though that it showcases like like I was saying, that repression, even though it's necessary in some elements, it leads to things that are not conducive to, I guess, being functional in society, right? Like, you know, Ennis at the end of our story is living in a trailer and isolated from his family,
It
and
has
not
no friends.
has no friends, like has no element of him that is positive, that has worked out for him in the end.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see, I guess, how that works, how that, like, how repression of that nature leads to that outcome, you know.
Yeah.
um what you said, you had one more question as well.
Yeah. How does the film frame desire? I think this is actually a very interesting part of this film because there are repressive like gay films, I think, where the love is painted in an inherently very tender, very idealistic way.
Yeah.
I don't think Brokeback Mountain paints desire that way at all. I
i
think
i
desire is
think
painted as a very mixed bag with a lot of
I will
dark
say,
and dangerous elements to it.
I think I think you're correct in that element. I think that Brokeback, in this sense, frames desire as a thing of, like, to sometimes be avoided, and it's very interesting
Yeah,
because
Jack Twist literally compares not even well homosexual his homosexual desires for Ennis, but he literally describes it as like heroin at a certain point in the film. That
yeah,
like he
and
can't stop, it's compulsive, and that he like and he is also the character who's a sex addict. You know what I mean? He is the one that takes all those risky trips to Mexico and has all those sex workers. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like he's
and
yeah.
like I said, it's a reaction. Like, his code, right, is a code that is uh one that seeks pleasure over pain, right? And that's
Yeah.
kind of his philosophy. At least Jack Twist's philosophy. Um,
Yeah.
I will say it's interesting in terms of desire, though. I think it's one of those things that's shown in this sense of the dangers of what desire for another can lead to, right? Um,
Mm,
and in this sense, it shows that, like, these two men, like, their desire for other, uh, is repressed, and it's takes a step back to other priorities, right? But the problem is, uh, they don't realize that that level of desire is interweaved with every other element of their life, right? Like,
what do you mean?
so so Jack and Ennis, right? They have this desire for one another, and they at least Jack wants it more than Ennis wants it, right? But by repressing it and by not giving in to that desire, but instead satiating it in these small annual trips, what they're actually doing is they're almost like microdosing their sort of lustful and desired behaviors, right? Um, and by doing that, they lie to the people who care about them, and they sort of isolate themselves in ways from those lies, from those people, and because of that, it leads to their downfall, right? So I think that this movie is actually a negative review of, like, what desire and passion for another can lead to.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's hard to say because repression obviously twists and distorts things, like whether or not their desires would be so destructive in a different environment. But
Mm,
like even the mountain itself, which is painted later in their lives in a romantic setting, like they almost freeze to death in the mountain. A sheep is like burned alive because of lightning striking the mountain and killing it.
yeah,
Like even the Brokeback Mountain itself, the most romanticized part of this film, pretty inarguably. is a place of danger and uncertainty and unpredictability, where really you can be killed at any point on the mountain. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think like if you frame it, it's hard for me to view desire in this film as a positive. I think you said it was a mixed bag. I'm curious to hear why you think what the positive elements of desire were in this film.
Well, like obviously Jack Twist dies, but like he pretty empirically lives a better life than Ennis because he is more daring. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like he moves away from Wyoming and he's able to reinvent himself. Like he doesn't really have a traditional lifestyle. He goes into like being a bull rider, and then that allows him to meet like one of the wealthiest women in Texas and
Hmm.
like the Bachelorette, and then he does see the world. He travels out of America. He travels around America. Like he has all these strong, powerful relationships with other people, however temporary or sexual. And he like um like I would say that Ennis's end is significantly darker and sadder than Jack Twist. Jack Twist's end might be a mixed bag, but like Jack Twist definitely got a lot more out of life. And I think, you don't see how Jack Twist dies, but like and like what his last words or anything, but like Jack Twist is pretty openly homosexual by the end of his life. Like
Yeah.
his parents know he's homosexual, his wife knows he's a homosexual. Like it feels like he, to some degree, was able to accept himself. You know what I mean? And to some degree, he was able to achieve the things he wanted to achieve at the beginning of the story, um,
Yeah.
outside of his relationship with Ennis. So I feel like he, it's complicated, but I feel like he is painted as like really the one who was right in their
Yeah.
dynamic.
I will say I would agree with that. It seems like the narrative of the story is obviously that there's more freedom in truth than a lie, right? Um,
Mm.
so it is interesting to see how, I guess, from a character perspective, to see how the two men react to their truth, right?
Mm.
Um, but yeah, other things you want to talk about and discuss?
Not particularly. I'm ready to rate this one.
Okay. Do you want to go first since, I thoroughly enjoy this film and I'm curious where you're going to rate it?
Sure. I think it's a landmark film that covered a lot of taboo subjects. I think a lot of the aesthetics of the film are well done. I think this film is too long. I think it has tonal problems. I don't think the characters are very fleshed out. I think and therefore the story is quite static. And I don't think this is a story that very easily lends into you empathizing or entering the world of these characters. I think the best parts of the film are not even the beginning of the film, which is often the one where all the trailers and people talk about the landscapes. I think the best part of the film is the last 15 or 20 minutes after Jack dies. And Ennis meets his wife and travels about, meets his parents. And, it made me realize, though, how empty the rest of the film is. Like, so little of the film is Jack Twist and Ennis interacting. So much of the film after they leave Brokeback Mountain the first time is them with their families. Like, they're not really impacted by their families that much. They're not really around each other. The chemistry, I feel like, isn't there that much. So, like, for me, this film is a six. I think this film was a landmark, but I think there are many better films that have been created past it that tell this story in a much better way.
So,
Um,
as much as this pains me, I think a lot of the opposite. Obviously, this film to me is not only a landmark film but a great piece of cinema. Something that I think uh, showcases a time in the American West that I think is real, that is raw, that speaks, I think, can still speak to elements of homosexual repression to even today. Um, and I think it's truly beautiful for that fact. And that is why it is a 9.5 for me.
really.
Yeah. Again, our grading scales are really different. I'm
I'm a harsher grader
I'm a little
by
more
like a
lenient,
point and a half.
but yeah, it's genuinely a 9.5 for me.
Well,
Uh,
maybe you'll feel differently one day, but like I don't know. Like if you watch a really great romance film, like About Time or something,
well, I have
I
seen
don't
About
think this
Time.
film.
About Time is
I don't
fucking
think,
fantastic.
but you'll never reach that level of emotional like chemistry or like the level of intimacy that that film has versus this one, or Priscilla, or like I'm not a super huge fan of this film either, but like fucking Moonlight. I think it's night and day
Uh,
the difference in chemistry in Moonlight versus this film.
Again,
Like you really do feel like
I
those characters in Moonlight, either the young version or the older versions of the two main characters,
listen.
you really feel
This
their
is
love for each other.
this is my Conan the Barbarian. Okay, this is the film I will die on a
Conan
hill
the
for.
Barbarian is a don't you dare. Conan the Barbarian is such a better film than this
We're
one.
not going to start this debate again. We're not going to do this again. But anyway, that was everything we had to say. Thank you guys so much for watching. Sorry about the delay. It's just a lot of shit's going on. So, but
Our
hopefully,
country is on fire.
yeah, it's not. Take care of yourself, folks. Please, literally, please take care of yourself. God. All right. Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for some more film content, and we'll see you guys pretty soon. Take care.